Hi all. I hope this is a good sub to post in. I posted elsewhere and someone suggested posting here. In this particular crime, the perpetrator is thankfully behind bars, but I still struggle with the why of it all. So my part of the story starts in 2009, and I was a junior in high school. I lived in a small town in Ohio. In the fall, I started to date my first real boyfriend, John. John was a senior, and many of his friends were dating my friends, and he was well-liked and funny at school. I was thrilled about the relationship, especially because my strict parents seemed to like John as well. He was pretty quiet around them, but always polite and appreciative of their presence. Since it's a small town, John literally lived right down the street, and we hung out all the time. My parents were actually getting divorced at the time, so I liked spending time at his place more than mine. John lived with Chris, a man who wasn't his biological dad, but someone he had lived with since around age 13, and often called Dad anyway. Chris was an adolescence counselor who knew John because he'd been in foster care, and he had taken John in himself. Chris was an amazing human who was fun to be around, and it was just the two of them and their pug Murphy at the house. I didn't know much about John's childhood at first, other than it had clearly been rough enough for him to be involved with child services. Anyways, we spent a lot of time together, and always had a good time with Chris as well. Eventually, John confided in me that he often had suicidal thoughts. I was shaken by this, and I told Chris about it as well. We continued to date though, and I did my best to support him. So the next year, I'm a senior, and John has graduated, but he's not really doing anything. He didn't go to college, and his plans to join the military weren't working out, so he was just living with Chris and working a part-time job that my dad had gotten for him. I've always been into school and extracurriculars, and I felt like John was holding me back. Our relationship was going downhill in many ways, but I was scared that if I broke it off with him, he might really kill himself. He had threatened to do so when I had tried before. In May 2001, I graduated high school and decided I had to leave the relationship behind. I was having my own depression issues, and John was having a detrimental effect on my health. I finally told him we had to break up, and he needed to stop contacting me threatening self-harm. I mostly cut off all contact, and a couple months later I got an apartment with a friend about 30 minutes away from home, and right beside the college I was attending. One Friday night in April 2012, I'm in my hometown to see a friend, and I pass John's house where I see police cars everywhere. I'm shocked and assume John must have attempted suicide, so I immediately called our mutual friend Kyle. Kyle had no clue what was going on with John, and he says John had just hung out at his house the day before. Kyle said John seemed like he was in a good mood, especially because he was driving Chris's Beamer at the time, which he loved to do. Anyways, Kyle was actually chilling at my apartment with my roommate. This was normal as he had a crush on her, so I just kept driving that way. When I got to my place, Kyle still hadn't heard anything, but my mom called me up with the scoop. She's friends with cops' wives, small-town stuff. It turns out that John murdered Chris and was on the run somewhere. Someone had called for a wellness check after not hearing from Chris for a while, and the cops found his body at home. I was shocked and a little scared, as were Kyle and my roomie, so we decided to stay at my roommate's parents' house for the night. By the morning, the cops had luckily found and arrested John. He had taken the Beamer, so it was easily spotted at a rundown motel, about 15 miles from his home and 12 from our apartment. When the details came out, the whole thing was even more horrifying. It was a brutal homicide, and it had occurred the days before the body was found. This means that John was just hanging out at Kyle's house between committing this act and getting arrested, just nonchalantly playing video games, telling jokes to Kyle's little sister, acting like everything was fine. Meanwhile, he had stuffed Chris's body in their freezer at home. It's insane to think about how someone could be such a psychopath, and there was no explanation given. John tried to plead insanity, but he was eventually deemed competent and then pleaded guilty. He got 30 to life in prison. I've obviously told this story from my perspective, but the person who really matters in this, of course, is the victim. And Chris was truly a saint of a human being. He had been my role model for so many years, and you just wonder how could something so horrific happen to someone so good, and at the hands of someone they had given everything to, someone they loved, trusted, and saw as a son. It's horrifying. Chris spent his life advocating for kids like John, and the local center he worked at is actually named after him now, as is the street that it's on. As I said to begin with, I often wonder about the why of it all. Chris and John got along most of the time, and though John clearly had mental issues, no one ever thought he would hurt anyone but himself. But clearly something was very wrong with John that we missed. They say hindsight is 20/20, and I can definitely look back and think of a few strange instances with John. Sneaky, manipulative, and angry. He eventually showed all of those traits, but I was lucky enough to not experience any violence at his hands. I wish I could say the same for Chris. I'm thankful for the time I did spend with him, and the positive impact he had on my life during that time. I know he had a positive effect on many others as well, so may he rest in peace. I've been doing my 1 hour of outdoor exercise at night because I find it most relaxing. My neighborhood is very quiet, and I'm lucky to live in a nice area which I've always considered super safe. I used to walk at night, even before lockdown, because I live right next to a canal. There are lots of nice paths that are super pretty at night, when everything is all lit up by the moon. Anyway, I was walking last night, and decided to go to the shop first because I was hungry. Then I detoured back to my usual route along the canal. When I was walking, I heard two men speaking loudly in German. I live in England, so it was a bit unusual, but not anything I thought twice about. They looked around 30, pretty tall, and they had caps on. I remember because they had matching designs, which I thought was pretty funny. They started getting really close, and when I glanced back to look at them, they started jeering. I knew they were looking at me, which kind of freaked me out, so I sped towards the shop, but had to stop at the road. I wasn't planning on getting hit by a car after all. They caught up with me pretty fast, but they didn't stop for the lights to change. They just walked across and went right into the store I was headed for. I shrugged off my hunger and decided to just go to the canal for my walk. I stopped thinking about the men soon after, chalking it up to me being a generally anxious person. I don't particularly like walking past strangers at night, and I'm self-conscious enough as it is without them talking to or about me. Anyway, I complete my walk, and I'm on the way headed back home. For the store to make sense, I need to describe where I was stood. On my right, there's the water itself. I'm stood on the path, and to my left, there's a big drop that goes straight on to the main road. Next to that, there's a row of houses. There's a railway bridge right in front of me. I have my earphones in, and my music is pretty loud, but I thought I could make out the sound of someone shouting. I took one earphone out and listened, but it was pretty silent apart from the passing cars on the road below me. And that's when I saw two men heading towards the bridge. I immediately recognized them as the two men who had jeered at me before from their caps. I stopped walking as my anxiety flooded back, and considered phoning somebody. I irrationally thought that if I'm on the phone when they walk past me, they wouldn't bother me. But despite the fact I'd been stood frozen for ages, nobody came out from under the bridge. I waited and stared at the bridge for a while, in complete confusion because there's no way they could have just vanished. I could see through to the other side of the bridge, so I know they didn't turn around or walk away or anything, but they certainly hadn't walked through because no one had passed me. After a few moments, I started to think I had hallucinated them or something. I have no history of hallucinations, but I couldn't explain it any other way. I started to slowly walk towards the mouth of the bridge, and just as I'm about to step in, I see it. The shadow of one of the men cast across the wall. My blood literally ran cold, and I realized what was going on. They were waiting for me at the other side of the bridge, but they must have hidden behind the abutment so I wouldn't see them. My mind went a million different places, panicking about what they would do if I walked under that bridge. I was convinced they'd just follow me if I stayed where I was and phoned for help. I was certain they'd come out to see what was going on and I'd be trapped. I did the only thing I could think to do. I quietly ran to the fence that separated the canal path from the drop to the main road and jumped it. It was only about thigh height, and on the other side there was a small space before the wall and the drop itself. I waited for a couple of moments as the cars passed, but thankfully I live in a quiet area so the road was soon empty. I managed to navigate myself so I could lower myself off the drop without A, making much noise, or B, hurting myself too much. And the moment my feet hit the road, I raced to the side where the houses were, and sped walked down that path as fast as I could without making noise. I only glanced back when I was nearing the end of the road. The men were still there, standing next to the bridge. I could see that they were looking around and through the bridge to see where I had gotten to. I felt sick and terrified, but thankfully I made it home. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know who they were or if they'll be there again tonight. But I do know I'm not going to be walking at night for a very long time. As a child, think kindergarten age, I loved to talk. If anyone had a question for me, I would gleefully give them way too much information. Most people found it endearing and would praise me for being so smart, which encouraged me a lot. My mom and I normally shopped at the market just a few minutes away from our house. My mom had been shopping there for 20-some years at that point, and was friends with almost all of the workers. I was pretty friendly with them too, and was always happy to talk with them. Whenever my mom got distracted talking to someone else, I, with the attention span of a 6-year-old, would wander around the aisle. My mom would keep an eye on me to make sure I didn't get too far, but if she was distracted, one of the employees would usually be around and gently guide me back over. One day, though, we went to a different market that I couldn't remember having been to before, and we didn't go back for nearly a decade. We were walking around the aisles when my mom ran into a friend of hers. They started talking, and I, not realizing that I no longer had a store full of adults keeping an eye on me, started to wander around the aisle. My eyes caught some colorful display, I think balloons or flowers or something, and I walked over to take a look. Once I was satisfied with my inspection, I turned back to the aisle, only to find that my mom was no longer there. That had never happened before. I looked around a little, though not moving from my spot near the colorful displays. Since it was right near the registers, there were a decent amount of people nearby, which I'm very thankful for now. As I looked around, an employee came up to me. He was older than my sister. She was around 12 or 13 at the time, and younger than my dad, in his mid-40s. That was about the only way I could gauge age at that time. Now I would say he was probably in his early to mid-20s if I remember right. "Hi there," he said sweetly, in a tone that you normally speak to kids in. I cheerfully said hello, stepping a little bit closer. "Are you looking for your mommy?" I said yes, happily explaining that I had last seen her talking to a friend, and that I could normally find her easily when I wandered away. I wasn't sure where she could have gone. "Does she leave you alone often?" "Not really. My older sister was normally with me if my mom wasn't. She was 12 or 13, super mature, so if my mom had to leave for a little bit, she knew I'd be okay, and she never left us alone in public, just at home if she needed to run somewhere. Never for very long, just the length of time of a Pokemon episode or something. My dad was at work a lot, and didn't come back until late usually, just if you were wondering." "Where do you live?" "Well, wouldn't you know it, I had just learned my address. We just learned how to mail a letter in school, even took a little class trip to the mailbox on our school corner to send 'em out. I knew how to write my address now, and I knew how to say it. Want to hear? Of course you do." I know kids are naive, but I was pretty downright dumb. I was diagnosed with doodle color blindness 2 years later, otherwise known as red-green color blindness. Makes sense, as I was totally blind to all of these red flags. Where do you go to school? Who picks you up? Well, I go to the local elementary school. I don't know the address, though. Sorry. I know what street it's on, though, because I wait on the sidewalk for my mom or daycare sitter, depending on the day. Do you like animals? Like puppies? Dogs scare me, cats scare me, pigeons scare me, fish scare me, flies scare me. You know what doesn't scare me, though? Turtles. I have 5 turtles. No dogs that bark or bite if someone drops by the house like our neighbor does. Those dogs are always locked behind the gate, though, so they don't scare me a lot. It had only been a few minutes since I'd last seen my mom, even with how much information I was just dumping. I was a very fast talker, but I was starting to get a little antsy. Not because I was uncomfortable talking to this stranger, but because I had skipped lunch that day specifically to con my mom into letting me get a bagel from the store next door, which was why we were at that market in the first place. My mom was holding on to the bagel to make sure I didn't try to eat it too fast and choke, which I'd done several times in the past. I wanted my bagel, and while I liked talking to this grown man who made me feel smart and was oh so interested in my life, I liked food more. And plus, if I caught my mom when we were near the bakery section, I might be able to use my charm and cuteness to get a cookie or something. So I gotta go find my mom now. Oh, well, I'll walk around with you and help you find her. You want to lead me through the market where you work, where you can easily bring me into a back room, meat locker, or any number of places? Yeah, sounds good. Ozzy! I turn around to see my mom. The relieved look on her face is slowly changing into something more anxious. I smile happily and wave her over. She immediately grabs my hand, and I can tell she wants to chide me, probably for leaving the aisle. She seemed more occupied on the man in front of me, though. Before I could even open my mouth to introduce him, or remember that I never even got his name in the first place, he quickly says that he's glad I found my mom, and he needs to get right back to work. He practically runs to the back of the store. My mom puts her hands on my shoulders and looks me in the eye, her expression a lot more worried now. "What was he talking to you about?" she asked, her voice more serious than I'd ever heard her. "Can I have my bagel?" My mom opened her mouth, paused, and went into her purse to hand me my bagel. Between bites, I happily told her about the conversation and everything I remembered. My age and grade, pickup schedule, likes, dislikes, my literal address. My mom gradually became paler, then became red with anger. She brought me over to the manager, and I don't really remember much about the conversation. I got a cookie, though. I remember that pretty well. It was shaped like a watermelon, which was apparently far more important to me than paying attention to what was being said. The police weren't called. We went home, and my mom told me I wasn't allowed to walk around the store anymore. No more talking to any strangers, even if they worked at the store we were at, unless she was with me. If I ever saw that man again, I was to run away, find someone I know, and ask for help. If all else fails, scream at the top of my lungs, just like when a fly lands on me. I agreed pleasantly, not really fazed by anything she was saying. I know that some people are bad, but bad people look bad, right? They talk mean and look scary and try to grab you. This guy didn't, so he couldn't have been bad, was he? But if my mom was saying it, then I thought I'd better listen. And I better enjoy that cookie too, because we were never going back to that store again. When I was around 12, our school had a safety assembly and was talking about the shady things adults do to get close to kids. A very, very watered-down version of what they most likely wanted. And as I'm sitting there listening, I suddenly realize, oh, if my mom hadn't found me, something bad would have happened. If not in the store, then in front of my school. If not in front of my school, then maybe even in front of my house. A little over a decade later, I'm 18 now. I've never seen the guy again, thankfully. Let's hope it stays that way.